Hey there, folks. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Rise Against, called Wolves. So I'll admit, I came to Rise Against fairly late. I knew their singles, at least those that crossed over to mainstream radio. I knew they had a few really strong early records before one of a few different sellout moments, depending on who you talk to. I remember that there was discussion surrounding how much you could really take seriously their very earnest political material, especially when they tended to paint for some broader strokes, or how as years wore on, the band just seemed to fade a little bit from relevance along with the rest of rock radio. Now, most of this I only discovered years after the fact. And yeah, while I have no qualms bucking against popular consensus, this mostly tended to be true, with their first two albums holding up to this day as being really strong hardcore punk records. And while I've always admired their pop sensibility, you can't deny that it started coming through on records like Siren Song of the Counterculture, and especially by Appeal to Reason. They just kind of dulled some of that edge. That said, when I covered The Black Market with John over at ARTV back in 2014, I actually really liked that album, a fair bit more than I was expecting. Sure, it was an older, slower, more weary-feeling album, but it used that time to refine the compositions and the writing to cut a lot more deeply. And I stand by that record being underrated to this day by a lot of even Rise Against fans. Hell, I put People Live Here on my year-end list as one of the best songs of 2014, and I stand by that. And if that song showcases what can happen when Rise Against focus and refine their material, I had some hopes going into their album this year called Wolves. And obviously it was going to be touching on the election of last year, their political ban that was happening regardless. But what caught more of my interest is that they had parted ways with their longtime producers Bill Stevenson and Jason Livermore, thanks to a move to a new label. Now on this album, they were working with Nick Raskulinecz, who had been behind records from Mastodon, Deftones, Korn, and that Ghost record before Meliora that nobody really cares about. So, okay, what does this mean for Rise Against going forward in 2017? Well, honestly, I kept wishing that I liked this a lot more than I do. I've gone over this album a number of times, and on a certain level, I'm expecting to like it more, but if I'm drawing a comparison back to even The Black Market, Wolves just kind of leaves me feeling a little bit cold. I'm not saying that's bad by any stretch. For what I was expecting, Rise Against delivers a sort of hotly populist set of anthems that resonate across the political climate, and there's the broadly sketched nuance that I otherwise expected, but beyond that, I'm just not really feeling this as much as I want to. But I'm kind of struggling to pin down why. It's a good album for sure, but it's not really a great one, at least for me. Because let's start off with the writing, and let's start off with what works, and that is a lot of the content. No, I don't think there's anything here that quite captures the heft of People Live Here. That is a high watermark that I'm not sure Rise Against will hit again anytime soon, especially given how oddly rushed some parts of this album feel. But Wolves, it isn't aiming to be as dramatically potent and poetic as that song was, instead aiming for the sort of lean viciousness intended to both intimidate and inspire. And as I go through my checkboxes for political art, more often than not, Rise Against capture that populism and power that they need, even if I don't quite feel they're as precise as they could be. Not exactly helped by the inclusion of a few relationship-related songs that don't really fit in with the rest of the album. No, don't get me wrong. Neither House on Fire or Politics of Love are bad songs per se, and Rise Against always has had a few of these sorts of songs to balance things out on many of their records. But when the rest of this album is as focused and tight as this is, they can feel a little bit unnecessary. I might have cut them. And one thing I do like is that Rise Against aren't afraid to speak from the ground up and highlight how much they share a lot of the fears of pretty much everyone else in the mainstream population. And when they are getting more accusatory, there is a balance in it. Take the rather directly named song Bullshit. Sure, there is plenty of targeting to those who want things to go back to normal and are willing to accept oppression just for the sake of stability, unwilling to admit any actual culpability in the last election. But in the same song, he also pivots to talk about the left, who are more concerned with infighting rather than celebrating the common causes and striking back as a unit. Or take Parts Per Million, a song about climate change from both the perspective of the person on the ground who wouldn't otherwise care because it doesn't directly impact him, and yet can't help but notice that something does feel to be a little bit wrong, things are getting hotter, and it also comes from that activist realizing that they are running out of time, they need to appeal these these people and strike that chord. Then you have the violence that questions whether or not we are made to be aggressive in the image of God, or whether or not we can pull away from war in time. Mourning in America speaks to the disruptive and distracting power of propaganda. And while you could tell they're amused by how much the current president is being held to account for a lot of the things he's saying and doing on how many walls, they also seem very much aware of how susceptible the image of the United States is to change, and how they could very well easily become the villains that they once fought against in history. Now, where I think Rise Against actually gets the most mileage, though, is talking about hope. The closer miracle, it's one more obvious point, a call to action instead of just remaining paralyzed for help. But the song that really jumped out for me is Far From Perfect, where the hard front has just collapsed into fragments, but from the shards, a stronger mosaic can be forged in shared emotion, highlighting in all those differences between us. There was some really great, well thought out imagery on that song that I really liked. Now, of course, all this can feel a little bit broadly sketched. This is Rise Against we're talking about, and they're speaking to general topics and as many as they can possibly cram in to get their entire message across. Which means that differentiating these anthems beyond the language and the delivery, it becomes essential, and it's also where I think the band does slip up a little bit. Now, for those who are looking forward to the more aggressive tempos and delivery that weren't really there in the same way on the black market, I think Wolves will definitely satisfy you, but there's also a part of me that can't help but feel that the hooks, they just don't pop for me in the same way. And yeah, part of this is the production from Nick Rascal Linux, who seems to be emphasizing a lot more of the edge and fuzz more than the melodic body of some of the guitar tones, along with some rather inconsistent bass production. Sometimes very much forward to the front of the mix, but sometimes it just doesn't have that same tempo and texture to it. While part of me just can't help but feel that this is a compositional issue as well. I appreciate a back-to-basics approach when it comes to the main instrumental framework, especially if you're on a new label with a new producer with an extremely hard to pronounce name, but I wasn't crazy about nearly as many of these hooks as I wanted to be. And considering the guitar layering doesn't really modulate across 11 very anthemic songs, it can make individual melodies start to run together a little bit. Now, there are exceptions, of course. The violence interjects a sharper groove and that roiling bass and guitar lick overall that I really liked. There's an upstroked staccato guitar line on the verses of Bullshit that certainly stands out, but on the flip side, the main groove on Parts Per Million never seems to really hit a stable point, and that's not counting the fact that in terms of the tone and progression, many of these songs feel kind of a little by the numbers for Rise Against. They're good songs, but they never really transcend that point or just being good. Part of this is the lack of any sort of ballad to really change things up, but you don't even get something as divergent as Zero Visibility that showed up on the black market. I'll freely admit that Far From Perfect is one of the most pop songs on the album, but it also stands out beyond the content and the occasional sloppy backing vocals and the odd obsession with millennial whoops to fill up space, which is more often than you would otherwise expect for Rise Against. But overall, the impression that I get when listening to this particular Rise Against album is a desire to be very topical and political right now in a lot of the content. Get right to the forefront with the right message, and if the overall music behind it feels a little less experimental while letting a lot of the fury pick up the pace, well, look, I get that. There's obviously an appeal to that. But I also can't deny that for me, if you're going for such broad, direct strokes in your writing without greater modulation in a lot of your instrumentation, things can just start to blur together a little bit. Again, that's not saying this is a bad album, because I like a lot of these tones that are blurring across, and the writing clicks, there are good hooks, a few standout songs. This is going to give me a very light 7 out of 10. But at the same time, if you're not a fan, or if you've been a fan since the very beginning, this record probably will not surprise you. Kind of ironic in chasing lyrical relevance now, they may have forfeited some of it in the composition in the long term, but still, it's a pretty worthwhile project all the same. So yeah, check it out. Worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I know I probably bungled that producer's name a couple of times. I practiced. I honestly had to do so many retakes trying to get it right. Beyond that, if you want to buy the record, links in the description below, and I got the poll up there for more Rise Against fans to weigh in. I'm actually curious where you guys fall on this. You probably have more familiarity with the band than I do. I wouldn't consider myself a huge fan. I'm curious where you guys fall on it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right there, where 3 times a week you contributors get to vote on my schedule, and once a week the higher contributors get to add records or even movies there. More details right there, but till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.